Hello everyone, and welcome to the Complex Cinema channel. We are so glad to have you here with us today. If you enjoy our content, please make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the film, Hey, Sickly Prince, Your Mind to Fix. The narrative unfolds around a deeply troubled young man, a prince whose very constitution seems frail, earning him the moniker, Sickly Prince. His existence is a fragile tapestry woven with illness, a condition that has perhaps shaped his perception of the world more than any royal decree. Into this cloistered, pale existence stumbles a character whose presence is anything but quiet. This individual, often portrayed with an almost aggressive vitality, carries an air of determination that borders on obsession. It's a dynamic that immediately brings to mind the stark contrasts often explored in period dramas, where robust health confronts delicate vulnerability. The core conflict centers on the protagonist's self-appointed mission, to mend the prince. This isn't merely an act of kindness, it possesses a driving, almost consuming focus. We see flashes of the savior's own past, perhaps hinting at some personal trauma or a history where they felt powerless, leading to this intense need to exert control over another's well-being. It mirrors the thematic explorations seen in early works of artists who channeled intense emotional energy into meticulous detail, trying to impose order on chaos. Their interactions become the heart of the story. Initial resistance from the prince, rooted in years of learned helplessness, and perhaps a quiet resignation to his fate, slowly begins to erode under the relentless, yet often surprisingly tender, ministrations of the fixer. The fixer employs unconventional methods, challenging the sterile routines of the royal physicians. There are scenes suggesting an almost artistic approach to healing, perhaps drawing inspiration from ancient holistic practices that prioritize spirit alongside body, a direct counterpoint to the rigid, chemical-heavy solutions usually favored by institutional medicine. As the prince begins to show incremental improvements, the relationship deepens beyond that of patient and caregiver. There is an undeniable intimacy born from shared vulnerability. The fixer starts to reveal more about their own drive, maybe connecting their quest for the prince's health to a broader ambition or a defining philosophy learned during their formative years, perhaps time spent traveling or studying obscure texts, far removed from courtly intrigue. The narrative builds toward a climax where the prince must confront not just his physical ailments, but the psychological constraints imposed by his illness and his royal role. The fixer, in their relentless pursuit, perhaps pushes too hard, forcing a confrontation where the prince must choose between the familiar comfort of sickness and the frightening prospect of wholeness and responsibility. It's the classic moment where the student surpasses the teacher, or perhaps realizes the teacher's motives were not entirely selfless. The resolution isn't necessarily a triumphant return to perfect health, but rather an acceptance of a new equilibrium. The prince gains agency, stepping out from the shadow of his perceived weakness. The fixer, having achieved their goal, might find themselves somewhat adrift, their defining purpose momentarily fulfilled. The story concludes by suggesting that sometimes fixing another person is ultimately about learning how to live fully oneself, a sentiment echoed in many narratives where a passionate outsider disrupts a stagnant system. The lingering impression is one of transformation, achieved through an unlikely, intensely focused bond. The sickly prince, confined largely to chambers draped in muted silks, presents a figure of almost ethereal fragility. One senses in his listless movements and the perpetual shadow beneath his eyes the weight of inherited frailty, perhaps a bloodline cursed by generations of inbreeding common in sequestered royal families. His initial demeanor is one of profound, almost philosophical detachment. Illness has provided him a unique, albeit unwanted lens through which to view the superficiality of court life. He has mastered the art of polite refusal, a subtle defense mechanism honed over years of unwanted medical interventions. The fixer, whose origins remain deliberately murky, perhaps a skilled commoner or someone exiled from a family of healers, possesses an energy that seems almost violent in contrast to the palace's quiet air. Their movements are sharp, their gaze unwavering, reminiscent of a young, ambitious virtuoso musician determined to master a notoriously difficult concerto, channeling sheer willpower into physical execution. There is an almost aggressive empathy driving them. They don't merely want the prince well. They seem compelled to prove that his sickness is a solvable equation, a personal challenge to their own capabilities. We see in their relentless pursuit echoes of a personal narrative where they once failed to save someone important, perhaps a sibling or mentor, fueling this current, almost desperate need for success. The turning point in their relationship often arrives through small, almost accidental moments of shared humanity. Perhaps over a shared, illicit cup of strong, dark tea that bypasses the strict royal apothecary's regimen. The prince begins to see past the fixer's imposing intensity to the genuine care underneath, recognizing a mirror to their own suppressed desire for life. The fixer, in turn, is forced to slow down, to observe the subtle linguistic cues the prince uses to mask pain, recognizing that true healing requires understanding the language of the soul before applying any balm. It is in these quieter moments that the fixer's earlier artistic inclinations, maybe a past as a dedicated student of anatomical drawing or herbal lore gained from solitary journeys across rugged terrain, surface, informing their personalized approach to treatment. As the prince starts to gain color in his cheeks and the fog lifts from his eyes, the court reacts with suspicion and resentment. The established medical staff, whose authority is built on the prince's long-standing condition, view the fixer as an arrogant upstart, threatening the established order of courtly expertise. This external pressure serves to further bond the prince and the fixer, isolating them together against the machinations of propriety. The emotional climax often involves the prince having to publicly reject the old ways, a declaration of self-sovereignty, perhaps articulated through a long, difficult walk unaided, the fixer standing just out of reach, symbolizing the transition from dependence to independent strength. The fixer's greatest triumph is not the physical recovery, but the awakening of the prince's inherent royal will, transforming him from a beautiful, tragic object into an active participant in his own destiny. The prince's chambers, once a sanctuary of passive suffering, begin to feel like a stage for an uneasy yet profound transformation. His wardrobe shifts subtly. The somber velvets are slowly interspersed with lighter fabrics, almost as if he is testing the very air against his newly energized skin. Emotionally, the prince exhibits a nuanced reaction to his improving health. There is a flicker of exhilaration, quickly followed by crippling anxiety. The fear of falling back into the familiar narrative of weakness is almost as potent as the disease itself. He clings to the rituals the fixer introduces, not just the herbal decoctions or prescribed exercises, but the act of being truly seen without pity. This aligns with the introspection often seen in autobiographies of individuals who transition from long-term anonymity to public recognition. The scaffolding of their old identity crumbles, leaving a raw, exposed self. The fixer, meanwhile, reveals the scars of their past with increasing transparency. Perhaps they were once a promising young military surgeon who lost a critical patient due to bureaucratic delay, instilling in them a deep-seated contempt for slow, institutional processes. This explains their almost military efficiency in organizing the prince's daily regimen. However, beneath this determined exterior lies a surprising tenderness, particularly noticeable when they deal with the prince's residual bouts of coughing or fatigue. They do not rush the recovery. They honor the stops and starts. Their inspiration seems drawn from the relentless optimization principles found in engineering. Every failure in the treatment plan is meticulously documented and immediately adjusted, much like a craftsman constantly refining a complex mechanism. The central dramatic tension escalates when the fixer is confronted by the royal council, who demand accountability for deviating from established medical doctrine. This confrontation serves as a crucible for the prince. Forced to defend the outsider who saved him, the prince must employ the rhetorical skills he absorbed simply by listening to court debates for years. He speaks not with the timid voice of the invalid, but with the measured authority of someone who understands what genuine struggle entails. This moment is akin to watching a prodigy composer finally conduct their own complex symphony, demanding recognition from the seasoned orchestra. The resolution is marked by a quiet farewell, the fixer having fundamentally altered the landscape of the palace simply by refusing to accept the status quo, recognizes that their work is done. A truly successful fixer must know when to step away, preventing codependence from simply replacing illness as the defining relationship. The prince, now walking without the invisible crutch of assumed frailty, does not shower the fixer with titles or riches, which would be a return to the old dynamics. Instead, he offers something far more valuable, a promise of continued self-advocacy and a deep, unspoken respect. The final image is often of the prince looking out of a window, not confined by the glass, but observing the world with an active curiosity, suggesting that the greatest cure administered was the restoration of agency itself. The aftermath of the fixer's departure leaves a palpable void in the palace, a silence far more meaningful than the oppressive quiet that preceded their arrival. The sickly prince, now merely the prince, navigates the newly opened spaces of his life with a hesitant yet determined gait. His initial interactions with the court are fraught with an almost unbearable self-consciousness. He is acutely aware that the courtiers are not merely observing his health, but scrutinizing the very fabric of his transformation, searching for the first inevitable sign of relapse that would allow them to comfortably resettle him into his former role of beautiful, inert symbol. This vigilance is a new form of burden, a public performance of wellness that requires more stamina than his previous illness. It mirrors the precariousness faced by inventors whose groundbreaking prototypes are constantly under siege by skeptics eager to prove the technology flawed. The prince begins to apply the fixer's methodology, the relentless observation and refusal to accept surface explanations, to the political landscape around him. He starts to read the petitions not for their superficial pleas, but for the underlying power struggles they mask, recognizing the patterns of manipulation the fixer used to identify weaknesses in his constitution. He realizes that court politics is simply a larger, more insidious form of bodily ailment, requiring firm, unconventional intervention. He recalls the fixer's blunt pronouncements about toxic environments, realizing that the court itself was the most persistent pathogen. However, the absence of the fixer creates a vacuum that the prince must now actively fill. He misses the sharp edge of their challenging presence, the constant friction that forced clarity. He finds himself occasionally seeking out obscure texts the fixer had mentioned, volumes on military strategy or forgotten regional folklore, trying to reconstruct the mentor's thought process. This search for understanding evolves into a quiet act of personal study, a commitment to mastering the systemic structure of his kingdom, with the same meticulousness the fixer applied to his metabolism. The narrative shifts from physical recovery to political maturation, suggesting that true healing equips one not just to survive, but to lead with intentionality. The prince is no longer waiting to be mended. He is setting about the long, arduous task of mending his own domain. The prince's newfound political engagement is often met with passive resistance. The aristocracy, deeply invested in the predictable weakness of the former heir, finds his probing questions and sudden interest in budgetary allocations deeply irritating. They treat his efforts with the patronizing air reserved for a child playing at governance, a reaction that would have sent the old prince retreating, but which now fuels a cold, analytical resolve. He has learned that sometimes radical change requires an almost theatrical display of unexpected strength. He starts holding court in the morning hours, traditionally reserved for the most tiresome ceremonial duties, utilizing the clarity of that early light to expose inconsistencies in reports, channeling the fixer's impatience with obfuscation into royal decree. Meanwhile, the fixer, now untethered from their singular purpose, moves through the world with a restless, almost nomadic energy. There are fleeting rumors carried on the winds of trade, sightings in distant port cities, whispers of unparalleled success in treating a plague sweeping through a minor duchy, or perhaps even a period of intense, solitary study in a remote monastery dedicated to physical and spiritual discipline. These rumors serve to validate the prince's faith in the fixer's methods, but also underscore the essential incompatibility between the fixer's boundless drive and the static confines of courtly life. The fixer, much like a celebrated composer who burns out after completing a single, perfect opera, finds that the subsequent silence is deafening. Their genius requires continuous, high-stakes problem-solving that the prince's now stable realm no longer offers. There is one instance, hinted at rather than shown directly, where the two paths briefly converge again. A discreet message arrives, not from the fixer directly, but via an intermediary, perhaps an obscure herb or a carefully chosen, well-bound book delivered anonymously. This object contains no explicit counsel, but rather serves as a subtle affirmation, a check-in. The prince recognizes the deliberate choice of gift. It is not a remedy for sickness, but a tool for endurance, validating his shift from patient to ruler. It suggests the fixer understands that the greatest danger now is complacency, and that true mastery involves maintaining a state of active readiness. The prince places the item prominently on his working desk, a talisman against the soft decay of unchallenged power, knowing that the legacy of their intense, brief collaboration is not just his health, but a permanently altered perspective on what it means to be strong. The prince's governance begins to take on the character of a carefully managed medical regimen, applying structured discipline to the sprawling, diseased body of the state. Where once he would defer to the ancient wisdom of his advisors, he now demands quantifiable results, often citing comparative mortality rates or efficiency statistics he's painstakingly gathered from old regional ledgers, a clear appropriation of the fixer's data-driven approach. This cold logic often clashes spectacularly with the inherited sensibilities of the court, who view any sudden reform as deeply disrespectful to the legacy of his late, perpetually ailing father. The prince, however, moves forward with the focused intensity of a cartographer, mapping unknown, dangerous territory, having learned from the fixer that fear of making an error is often more damaging than the error itself. The fixer's influence manifests subtly in the prince's personal habits. He takes his meals away from the lavish, overly rich banquets, preferring simple, nourishing fare prepared under his own scrutiny. He insists on daily, brisk walks through the palace gardens, regardless of the weather, often shaking off the few attendants who try to match his pace. This public display of physical capability is a deliberate, ongoing act of defiance against the ghost of the sickly prince everyone still expects to see. It is a testament to the fixer's profound understanding of psychosomatics, that changing the narrative of the body inherently changes the narrative of the self. Yet, this necessary rigor occasionally edges into unhealthy obsession. The drive to prove the cure permanent sometimes makes the prince inflexible, unable to tolerate minor setbacks in his reform efforts. He becomes isolated once more, though this time by his own exacting standards rather than by illness. This period reflects the later career stage of highly successful innovators who struggle to delegate, believing only their personal, perfected methodology can yield true results. There's a yearning for the fixer not as a source of healing, but as a fellow traveler who understood the sheer exhaustion of maintaining perfection. The unspoken resolution between them is confirmed when a significant external threat emerges, perhaps a diplomatic crisis or a localized uprising, that forces the prince to rely on ingenuity rather than tradition. He handles the crisis with decisive, unorthodox maneuvers that echo the fixer's own signature style. Direct confrontation, coupled with precise, calculated risk. He successfully navigates the storm, not through brute force, but through intellectual agility, honed during those months of forced recovery. In that moment of triumph, the prince understands that the greatest gift was not restored health, but the acquisition of a formidable, self-reliant internal architecture, built piece by painful piece under the exacting tutelage of an unlikely savior. The prince, now firmly established as a formidable monarch, directs his administrative energy towards purging the institutional inertia that once suffocated him. His investigations into the royal finances and infrastructure reveal layers of corruption so deeply ingrained they resemble malignant tumors within the state's very structure. He approaches these matters with a chilling detachment, viewing the corrupt officials not as enemies to be punished vengefully, but as systemic failures to be excised efficiently. This mirrors the precise surgical approach the fixer once took to his own afflicted body. The prince champions meritocracy in appointments, elevating capable but previously overlooked individuals, often those who share a similar background of quiet competence outside the traditional noble circles, creating a new inner circle that mirrors the fixer's own outsider status. Occasionally, the prince will revisit the wing of the palace where the fixer had resided during the treatment period. These rooms are kept meticulously preserved, not as shrines to a lost love or a mentor, but as working laboratories of memory. He might pick up a discarded sketching tool or a half-finished diagram of some obscure circulatory system the fixer used as a teaching aid, instantly recalling the sound of their voice, explaining the necessity of flow and pressure. These moments are tinged not with sadness, but with a fierce gratitude for the rigorous education he received, an education in willpower disguised as convalescence. The fixer, it is learned through intercepted correspondence concerning international affairs, has not settled into a single vocation, but has instead become a kind of itinerant catalyst, appearing wherever established norms are proving fatal. There is a brief mention of them, advising a beleaguered sovereign across a treacherous mountain pass using innovative engineering knowledge, perhaps gained from studying ancient Roman aqueducts during their own restless youth, to secure a crucial trade route. This confirms the prince's belief. The fixer cannot be contained. Their purpose is the disruption of stagnation wherever it occurs. The final, emotional resonance of their story arrives during a public address. The prince, addressing his newly reformed military leadership, speaks not of inherited divine right, but of resilience forged through adversity. He makes an oblique, powerful reference to a time when he was told his fate was sealed by biology, declaring with unshakable conviction, "But fate is only the first draft. The true character of a life is determined by the edits we make, fiercely and without apology." It is a direct echo of the Fixers' philosophy, a public validation of their shared, transformative struggle. The prince is now the master editor of his own history, and by extension, the history of his realm, a living monument to the power of aggressive, uncompromising betterment. Years pass, and the prince, now the reigning king, presides over a surprisingly vigorous and efficient kingdom. The memory of his illness has faded in the public consciousness, replaced by the legend of the strong ruler who overcame impossible odds. Yet within the intimate sanctuary of his private study, the king often finds himself grappling with a subtle, gnawing sense of isolation that his political victories cannot entirely quell. He has successfully fixed the state, but the nature of true, intimate connection remains elusive. He is surrounded by loyal, capable subjects, men and women educated in the king's new meritocratic system, but none possess the sheer, disruptive force of the Fixer. Their loyalty is professional. The Fixer's influence was elemental. This isolation is exacerbated by the realization that his methods, while effective for large-scale institutional reform, lack the necessary personal warmth for true companionship. He maintains the rigorous schedule, the early rising, the dedication to factual inquiry. But the spark, the almost dangerous enthusiasm the Fixer brought to even the smallest task, is absent in his own disciplined routine. It is a common pitfall for those who ascend through sheer force of will. The triumph of order often necessitates the suppression of spontaneity. He sometimes wonders if the Fixer, in their perpetual motion, found a way to integrate their fierce energy with human connection, or if their very nature demanded they remain a necessary, temporary anomaly. One late autumn evening, while reviewing correspondence from foreign ambassadors, a duty he now performs with an almost bored mastery, a hand-delivered, heavily sealed scroll arrives. It bears no official crest, only a peculiar, almost archaic wax seal depicting a coiled serpent consuming its own tail, a symbol the king instantly recognizes from the Fixer's obscure library of arcane texts. The contents are sparse, written in the familiar, sharp script. A single line referencing a rare mountain bloom that only opens fully during the deepest winter frost, followed by coordinates pointing toward a remote, neutral territory far beyond the king's immediate borders. The message is not an invitation, nor is it a request for help. It is, rather, an acknowledgement of his enduring strength, framed in the language of shared challenge. It implies that even a king, having conquered the illness of the body and the illness of the state, must still contend with the inherent mysteries of existence, the perpetual frosts of life that demand a constant, internal readiness. The king smiles, a rare, genuine expression that creases the usually stern lines around his eyes. He understands. The Fixer has not returned to fix him again, but has instead offered him a final lesson. The greatest achievement is not the cure, but the capacity to face the next, inevitable cold snap, armed with the tools of resilience they once imposed upon him. He does not dispatch an envoy. He merely nods, closes the scroll, and turns back to his maps, the distant coordinates burning as a quiet, vital promise of continued self-mastery. The king's reaction to the cryptic message is measured, an internal calibration rather than an outward explosion of joy or alarm. He commits the coordinates to memory with the same efficiency he applies to state secrets, a testament to the neural pathways cemented during his arduous recovery. The mountain bloom, the aeternitas glacialis perhaps, becomes a metaphor he immediately integrates into his worldview. Beauty and strength forged only under extreme duress. He realizes the fixer, in their infinite understanding of human psychology, knew a direct appeal or reunion would shatter the carefully constructed independence he had achieved. Instead, they offered a challenge, a final piece of esoteric curriculum designed not to cure a physical ailment, but to illuminate the ongoing nature of existence. He recognizes that the fixer, in their relentless pursuit of optimal function, mirrors the very process of natural selection, constantly seeking out the next point of necessary evolution. This philosophy, initially directed at saving one sickly prince, has become the operational mandate for an entire kingdom. The king often observes his ministers, noting those who have adapted to the high-pressure environment he created, and those who, despite their loyalty, remain brittle and bureaucratic. The systemic failures he has not yet managed to fully excise or replace. There is a faint, almost mournful echo of the fixer's physical presence whenever the king engages in strenuous activity. When he rides his favored warhorse, a beast of formidable power that the old, frail prince would never have dared approach, the rhythmic exertion brings forth phantom sensations, the sharp, encouraging sting of a slap meant to rouse him, or the scent of the peculiar pungent poultices the fixer used to apply. These are not memories of pain, but visceral acknowledgments of the effort required to tear down old limitations. The king never replies to the message. He understands that communication now is action. His response is to further solidify the kingdom's defenses and expand its intellectual borders, dedicating substantial royal funds to establishing independent research academies, institutions dedicated to fearless inquiry, the kind that flourishes outside the stifling oversight of the established court. He is, in essence, creating an environment where the fixer's spirit can thrive, should they ever choose to pass through again, not as a patient's guide, but as an honored visiting scholar whose every pronouncement carries the weight of hard-won truth. The long, quiet reign continues, defined not by the cure of one man's sickness, but by the relentless, systematic application of radical self-improvement to the very concept of kingship. The king's establishment of independent research academies is perhaps his most enduring monument to the fixer's influence. These institutions are deliberately placed far from the capital, deliberately unburdened by centuries of court tradition or political maneuvering. They become incubators for unorthodox thinking, places where challenging established theories is not merely tolerated, but actively encouraged, echoing the fixer's initial, shocking disregard for royal medical doctrine. The curriculum, surprisingly, emphasizes physical discipline alongside intellectual pursuit, ensuring that the next generation of thinkers and administrators possess both sharp minds and resilient constitutions, a direct rejection of the inherent weakness that characterized the king's own upbringing. In his personal life, the king maintains a carefully curated austerity. He has no favorites, no confidants who resemble the intimate, fraught relationship he once shared with the fixer. This deliberate emotional distance is his armor. He understands that intimacy opens vulnerabilities, and a king must be a fortress. However, there are moments, usually late at night, while reviewing treatises on complex logistical challenges, how to feed a distant northern garrison through a harsh winter, for example, where a deep weariness surfaces. He has perfected the external facade of control, but the internal cost is the constant necessity of vigilance against the very complacency he seeks to eradicate in his subjects. He has become, in a sense, his own eternal fixer, tasked with perpetually diagnosing and treating the latent weaknesses of his own soul. The fixer, it seems, is aware of the king's trajectory. A traveler, Perhaps a merchant whose wares include exotic spices and maps passes through the capital once every few years. This individual never seeks an audience, but always leaves a small specific token at the palace gates, sometimes a sheaf of perfectly preserved dried herbs known for aiding focus, other times a small, intricately carved wooden puzzle that represents an unsolvable physical paradox. These gifts serve as silent acknowledgments from the anonymous fixer. I see you are maintaining the discipline. The project is ongoing. They are communications between two masters of execution who no longer require verbal reassurance, communicating instead through the flawless performance of their chosen tasks. The king regards these tokens not as mementos, but as necessary tools in a continuous refinement process. He understands that while he has inherited the mantle of power, the fixer gifted him the far more challenging inheritance. The awareness that perfection is not a destination, but a constant, exhausting process of revision. The story closes not with a reunion, but with the king, standing before the large map of his kingdom, tracing routes for new roads and improved irrigation, the physical manifestation of his inner, unbreakable resolve, a testament to the fact that the most profound change is often the one driven not by affection, but by the sheer, unyielding necessity of becoming whole. The king's solitude, born from necessity and cultivated through years of conscious choice, begins to show subtle fractures under the weight of absolute responsibility. While his governance is impeccable, the bureaucracy flows with an efficiency that baffles neighboring courts. The human cost of his uncompromising nature begins to manifest in the periphery. The highly capable officials he championed, products of the meritocratic system, are themselves becoming overly specialized, mirroring the king's own earlier narrow focus on physical restoration. They excel at their assigned functions, but lack the holistic, adaptive problem-solving skills the fixer instilled in their sovereign. The king notices a stagnation creeping into the innovation sector of his academies. They are now masters of the established techniques, proficient, but no longer daring to seek the radical solutions of yesteryear. This realization sparks a profound, internal debate. Did the fixer's true lesson involve achieving a stable, healthy state, or was the lesson the process of disruptive change itself? If the latter, then the king, by establishing stability, has inadvertently defeated the very spirit that saved him. He recalls the fixer's almost manic energy, the way they thrived on high-stakes instability, and understands that perfect health, political or physical, can breed a dullness fatal to true progress. This echoes the trajectory of many great scientific minds who, upon solving the primary mystery, often flounder in the ensuing peace, yearning for the next Gordian knot. Driven by this renewed anxiety, the king initiates a secret, unsanctioned project. He commissions the most obscure, geographically isolated research outpost, the one founded furthest from his direct, rule-bound influence, to study historical anomalies in periods of extreme societal upheaval. He subtly feeds them vague, almost philosophical inquiries about the nature of necessary disruption, phrasing the request as academic curiosity rather than policy directive. He is attempting to engineer a controlled environment for the emergence of a new, internal fixer, a system designed to spontaneously generate necessary friction. The final acknowledgement from the now legendary fixer arrives not as a physical token, but as a piece of intelligence, a precise warning note slipped into a coded diplomatic pouch meant for a friendly foreign power. The message concerns a border dispute brewing far to the south, detailing a tactical weakness in the regional defense that the king's own intelligence apparatus missed entirely. It is flawless information, impossibly accurate, suggesting the fixer has integrated themselves into the very flow of global information networks. The king reads the warning, and the familiar surge of energized focus rushes through him. He feels a momentary fierce kinship with this distant, unseen force. He immediately acts upon the intelligence, not with fear, but with the practiced confidence of a student executing a final exam under the watchful, distant eye of a master. He knows the fixer will never return to rule beside him, but their presence is now woven into the very fabric of his vigilance, an eternal, external pressure ensuring the king never allows his own victory to become his kingdom's terminal illness. The king's swift, decisive action on the southern border. Intelligence solidifies his reputation not just as a capable ruler, but as one touched by almost prescient insight. The rapid deployment of forces, utilizing the precise tactical remedy outlined in the anonymous note, averts a costly conflict, further cementing the myth surrounding his reign. The populace attributes this foresight to divine favor or sheer, unblemished luck, qualities the king privately scoffs at, knowing it is merely the application of superior diagnosis. Yet, this success sharpens his internal crisis. He is relying on a ghost for his most critical, unforeseen threats. He has built a perfect engine, but the crucial ignition spark still originates from an unknown, external source. The king becomes haunted by the ambiguity of the fixer's continued involvement. Is the fixer monitoring him out of lingering care, or are they simply treating the world as a larger, more complex organism in need of constant recalibration? This spectral mentorship breeds a subtle paranoia. Every unexpected piece of advantageous information is scrutinized for its potential trap, for the risk that the fixer might eventually demand an unbearable price for their unseen services. This is the fear of the saved, that the rescuer retains an unspoken, unpayable debt over the rescued. In a rare moment of profound exhaustion, the king permits himself a controlled indulgence in nostalgia. He summons the steward and requests the specific, slightly bitter blend of dark tea that first bridged the chasm between him and the fixer. The tea is brewed under his personal supervision, a direct violation of court protocol that no minister dares question. As the steam rises, carrying the scent of illicit comfort, the king closes his eyes, attempting to summon the feeling of that first shared moment of human connection, before the weight of destiny settled upon them both. He recognizes that the fixer never truly wanted him cured in the conventional sense. They wanted him activated. The sickness was the necessary catalyst for the creation of this king. The culmination of this internal reckoning arrives not through another message, but through a self-imposed test. Knowing the fixer monitors results, the king seeks out a political issue that defies logical, linear solution, a deeply entrenched cultural feud between two ancient noble houses that defies both bribes and decrees. Instead of applying the fixer's sharp logic, the king intentionally steps back, allowing the conflict to escalate to a near breaking point. He observes, with a strange detachment, the chaos, waiting for his own newly developed instinct to suggest an unorthodox, perhaps even emotionally resonant solution, one that honors the spirit of negotiation and shared vulnerability they briefly shared, rather than pure systemic optimization. When he finally intervenes, his solution is startlingly empathetic, a compromise that honors the dignity of both warring parties, something the old, detached king would have deemed inefficient sentimentality. He realizes with a sudden rush of clarity that the fixer's greatest lesson was balance. The strength of the body is irrelevant if the soul remains inflexible. The final victory is achieving a synthesis where the fixer's rigorous, scientific approach merges with the nascent, hard-won wisdom of the prince. The king looks toward the eastern horizon, not expecting a message, but simply acknowledging the space where the disruptive genius once resided, now internalized, a permanent, necessary flaw within his otherwise perfect system, ensuring that vigilance and the capacity for growth will never cease. The king's successful mediation of the noble feud sends ripples through the international community, not because of the magnitude of the conflict, but because of the manner of its resolution. It is an act of political alchemy, transforming ingrained antagonism into a fragile, functional truce. For the first time since the fixer departed, the king feels a sense of internal completeness, the knowledge that he has successfully synthesized the fixer's brutal objectivity with the inherent ambiguities of human governance. He no longer searches for the phantom touch. He is generating his own necessary friction. This internal integration allows the king to finally relax his rigid posture toward the past. He orders the royal chambers used during his convalescence to be renovated, not preserved. The sterile, controlled atmosphere is replaced with a library dedicated to cartography and ancient military philosophy, the subjects the fixer had hinted at mastering. He fills these rooms with the bustling energy of young scholars, encouraging debate and even controlled dissent among them. The silence that once defined his suffering is shattered by the sound of vigorous, ambitious minds at work, a deliberate counterpoint to the quiet desperation of his youth. The fixer, sensing this culmination through the subtle shifts in the kingdom's energetic pulse, sends one final, definitive communication. It arrives not as a puzzle or a coded note, but as a full, annotated manuscript slipped into the diplomatic pouch containing the treaties ratified after the southern border success. The manuscript is a detailed, almost affectionate critique of the king's early political maneuvers, juxtaposed with suggestions for the next logical phase of governmental evolution, a guide for sustainable systemic maintenance rather than emergency intervention. It is the master craftsman handing over the fully refined tools, not to stop working, but to build something entirely new. The king reads the manuscript in one sitting, his expression unreadable, save for the slight tension in his jaw. There is no gratitude expressed, no emotional flourish, only a profound sense of closure. The manuscript is the ultimate validation. The fixer acknowledges that the patient has not only healed, but has surpassed the teacher's initial expectations, evolving the treatment plan into a philosophy of perpetual progress. The king files the document away in the highest vault, not as state secret, but as a personal touchstone, the blueprint for a lifetime of necessary self-correction. The finality of this gesture frees the king completely. He is no longer defined by his illness or his savior. He begins to look at the future not as a series of threats to be neutralized, but as a vast, uncharted territory waiting for his systematic, yet now deeply compassionate, exploration. The king stands on the parapet of his castle, feeling the wind not as a threat to his lungs, but as a vigorous messenger carrying the scent of distance and possibility. The story concludes with the silent understanding that the greatest transformation is not escaping a cage, but realizing that one has already mastered the skill set required to build an entirely new and far grander structure from the ruins of the old. The narrative architecture of "Hey, sickly prince, your mind to fix" immediately signals its allegiance to a specific strain of historical fantasy melodrama, one that thrives on the friction between predetermined fate and fierce, unconventional agency. The film centers on the dynamic between the ostensibly doomed royal figure, Prince Elian, and the protagonist, a character often positioned outside the established social order, whose very presence upsets the delicate, rotting equilibrium of the court. Elian's fragility is not merely a plot device. It functions as the central magnetic field around which the drama orbits, a visual representation of the kingdom's deep-seated corruption. Elian's portrayal owes a significant debt to the aesthetic lineage of the beautiful but doomed male lead, echoing elements seen in early 20th century romantic literature filtered through the polished lens of contemporary East Asian historical dramas. His consumption or ailment, whatever its precise nature, demands an almost obsessive level of care, which becomes the primary vehicle for the protagonist's infiltration of the royal sphere. This is crucial. The illness is the key, not the tragedy itself. The protagonist, often possessing skills or knowledge deemed unorthodox, perhaps a background in folk medicine, forgotten scholarly texts, or even espionage, is thus granted access where conventional nobility would fail. The casting of the prince is vital. If the actor leans too heavily into martyrdom, the performance risks becoming inert. Instead, the best interpretations and the film's most engaging moments occur when Elian demonstrates flashes of sharp intellect or unexpected cruelty beneath the veneer of weakness. This suggests an inner life scarred by political maneuvering, an awareness of his own precarious position that transcends mere physical suffering. This duality mirrors the careers of many actors celebrated for their delicate, almost ethereal presence who consistently seek roles that demand psychological resilience, a deliberate subversion of their established screen persona, much like an actor known for light comedies, taking a demanding dramatic turn. The protagonist's drive, the mind-to-fix declaration, is rarely altruistic in its purest form. It is a narrative shorthand for seizing control. Whether motivated by a personal vendetta against the established regime, a genuine desire to harness the prince's untapped political potential, or simply survival within a highly competitive environment, her actions necessitate dismantling established power structures. Her expertise, which might be rooted in forgotten alchemical traditions or intricate knowledge of court protocol gleaned from a lower station, provides the necessary contrast to the stagnant, formal education of the royal advisors. This mirrors the career trajectory of actresses who intentionally select challenging, unconventional roles to demonstrate mastery over varied performance techniques, often emerging from less prestigious artistic backgrounds to eventually dictate the narrative terms. Visually, the film contrasts the suffocating opulence of the palace, all heavy velvets, shadows, and muted jewel tones, with the protagonist's more functional, perhaps earthier aesthetic. This visual dichotomy is essential to signifying the conflict, tradition versus necessary innovation. The director's choices regarding lighting often frame Elian in chiaroscuro, highlighting the shadows that cling to him, while the protagonist is frequently shown moving through spaces with a clear, almost harsh light, symbolizing her clarity of purpose against the court's murky dealings. The thematic undercurrents explore the transactional nature of salvation. The fixing is never free. The protagonist extracts a price, often in the form of loyalty, secrets, or eventual partnership. This moves the film beyond simple romantic fantasy into a complex study of symbiotic reliance. By the climax, the success of fixing the prince is inherently tied to the protagonist's own elevation or liberation. The film suggests that, in worlds saturated with systemic rot, true healing is always a political act, demanding the removal of those who profit from the sickness, with the restored prince serving as either the new, enlightened ruler or, more cynically, the potent symbol used to justify a hostile takeover. The lingering ambiguity about the true depth of their mutual affection versus their political necessity is what sustains the narrative's resonance long after the credits roll. The emotional choreography of the film hinges on the slow, meticulous dismantling of Elian's defenses. Initially, the prince is encased in a shell of practiced politeness, a performance perfected for survival within the viper's nest of the court. His interactions with the protagonist are colored by suspicion, masking a profound, almost debilitating loneliness. We see glimpses of the boy he might have been through his quiet appreciation for art or literature, a moment where he deviates from the prescribed courtly discourse to engage with something authentic. This vulnerability is the weapon the protagonist employs, not through blunt force, but through persistent, subtle acts of genuine care that contrast sharply with the forced pleasantries and manipulative gestures he receives from everyone else. The protagonist, in turn, carries her own baggage, often framed by a past trauma or a social slight that fuels her relentless focus. Her demeanor is rarely soft, even in moments of intimacy or shared vulnerability with Elian. There is an underlying steeliness, an analytical detachment that keeps the audience aware that her devotion is provisional, tied to the successful execution of her larger plan. Think of the protagonist's mannerisms, perhaps an economy of movement, a way of observing a room that betrays professional training in observation, reminiscent of characters in spy thrillers who must blend into high society while remaining utterly separate. This internal conflict, the emergence of genuine feeling warring with strategic necessity, is what elevates her from a simple rescuer to a compelling agent of chaos. When the narrative delves into the specifics of Elian's malady, it often becomes a metaphor for suppressed political expression. If the illness is something traditionally seen as feminine or weak, a persistent cough, a nervous tremor, the protagonist's treatment often involves reintroducing aspects of strength or assertiveness into his regimen, perhaps forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths or take minor, calculated risks. This mirrors historical narratives where influential women, barred from direct power, exerted influence by shaping the minds and bodies of the men who held the reins. The intensity of their physical proximity during these treatments, the application of tinctures, the forced rest, becomes the crucible where their unequal power dynamic shifts. For Elian, these moments are terrifyingly necessary. For the protagonist, they are controlled experiments in influence. The supporting cast plays a critical role in heightening the stakes through their palpable resentment of the protagonist's rapid ascent. These established courtiers, the established healers or advisors, function as the embodiment of the stagnation the film critiques. Their dialogue is laced with coded insults, referencing the protagonist's low birth or unconventional methods. Their efforts to sabotage the treatment, perhaps by tampering with medicine or spreading rumors, serve to underline the urgency of the protagonist and Elian forming an unbreakable, mutually beneficial pact against the established order. This external pressure forces Elian to make decisions demonstrating his returning capacity, often requiring him to publicly defend the protagonist, a moment that signifies his true return to agency, even if that agency is initially directed by her counsel. The film brilliantly utilizes these antagonists to chart the measurable progress of Elian's fix, transforming his health from a personal matter into a public, political declaration. The slow burn of trust between Elian and the protagonist is charted through a meticulous calibration of shared secrets and mutual exposure. Elian's initial attempts to maintain courtly distance crumble under the weight of his genuine physical suffering, forcing him into a dependence that strips away his royal facade. There are key scenes where this dependency manifests not in pleas for help, but in moments of profound, almost awkward gratitude for small comforts. A cup of broth made precisely right, a rare book delivered without asking, or simply an honest assessment of his grim prognosis rather than empty flattery. These acts of plain-spoken honesty become the bedrock of their alliance, a currency far more valuable than the gilded promises of his sycophants. The protagonist, despite her strategic brilliance, harbors a deep-seated impatience with the slow grind of courtly intrigue. Her emotions, when they surface, are usually explosive reactions to bureaucratic cruelty or blatant injustice witnessed firsthand, rather than purely romantic stirrings. Imagine the actress portraying her drawing upon the disciplined, focused energy often seen in actors who have mastered physical storytelling. Every gesture, from the way she grips a pestle to the set of her shoulders when facing down a skeptical duke, conveys intent. Her internal narrative is likely one of continuous calculation, where genuine affection for the prince is constantly being vetted against the probability of political leverage. This creates a captivating tension. The audience yearns for her to admit the emotional reality, while intellectually recognizing that admitting it might compromise her necessary detachment. Elian's evolution is subtly mapped onto his physical appearance and posture. As the film progresses, the heavy shadows surrounding him recede slightly. The actor might begin to inhabit his frame with less listlessness, his movements regaining a deliberate economy that suggests underlying strength rather than fatigue. The most poignant transformations occur not in grand speeches, but in the rejection of his old habits. Perhaps he stops accepting food presented by the old guard without question, or begins to offer his own pointed observations during council meetings, observations clearly seeded by the protagonist. This reawakening is often painful for him. Regaining vitality means accepting the reality of the machinations around him and taking on the burdens of his title, a transition from passive victim to active player, guided by his unconventional tutor. The chemistry between the leads is thus less about breathless romance and more about the electric charge of two intelligent minds recognizing an equal, albeit one positioned dangerously high and the other deliberately low on the social ladder. Their shared moments of intellectual sparring, debating state policy or historical precedents under the guise of discussing Elian's convalescence, are the true love language of the film. These dialogues serve to cement the protagonist's role not just as a healer of the body, but as a political and intellectual catalyst. This dynamic speaks volumes about the narrative's inspiration, often drawing from historical anecdotes where powerful female figures educated or mentored reluctant male rulers, fundamentally changing the course of governance through close personal proximity and superior strategic vision. The final implied contract is a shared throne, forged in the crucible of illness and conspiracy, a union where sentimentality is the dangerous outlier, always kept carefully in check. The inherent danger in the protagonist's success lies in the nature of the cure itself, which proves to be deeply ideological rather than purely pharmacological. Her methods, often involving the purging of corrupted court influences surrounding Elian, are interpreted by the establishment as not merely medical interference, but as outright treasonous manipulation. This sets the stage for the film's inevitable third-act confrontation, where the physical recovery of the prince is directly pitted against the political stability he is supposed to uphold. The protagonist's very expertise, the source of her power, becomes the focal point of the opposition's final gambit. They cannot defeat Elian while he is strong, so they must discredit the source of that strength, her. This external threat forces a critical inflection point in the relationship. The moment Elian must choose to protect his savior over the facade of courtly tradition. When the court moves to exile or execute the protagonist, accusing her of witchcraft or poisoning, Elian's response is the true measure of his transformation. If the film merely has him issue a decree, it remains shallow. A more compelling narrative demands an act of personal sacrifice or a demonstration of the cunning he has learned. Perhaps he orchestrates a public display of weakness, feigning a relapse to lure his opponents into a vulnerable position, mirroring the strategic feints seen in biographies of historical figures who seized power through deception rather than brute force. This calculated performance, echoing the protagonist's own early strategic maneuvers, signifies his full apprenticeship completed. The visual language surrounding this climax shifts dramatically. The heavy, claustrophobic interiors of the palace give way to scenes set in starker, more open environments. The throne room, under harsh daylight, or perhaps a secret council chamber where the true loyalties are revealed. The color palette, which favored deep reds and blues during the sickness phase, becomes dominated by whites and golds, symbolizing a dangerous, exposed clarity. The protagonist, who once moved in the shadows to survive, now stands illuminated, ready to face the consequences of her efficacy. This visual transformation underscores the theme that true health in this poisoned kingdom requires a public dismantling of illusion. Ultimately, the film resists a simple, happily ever after, predicated solely on mutual affection. The resolution leans towards a hard-won, politically expedient partnership. The final image often frames Elian and the protagonist side by side, not necessarily gazing lovingly at each other, but surveying the newly ordered court with an unnerving, shared comprehension of the ruthlessness required to maintain their position. Their success is measured by the silence of the opposition and the efficiency of the new regime they have engineered. The romance, if it exists at all, is secondary to the alliance forged in crisis, a testament to the idea that the most enduring bonds are often those cemented by shared secrets and mutual survival against overwhelming systemic odds. The lingering resonance of the ending, far from offering catharsis, leaves the audience grappling with the ambiguous legacy of the protagonist's intervention. Her fix was successful, but the prince she restored is intrinsically a different entity than the sickly figure she first encountered. Elian's newfound strength is not merely physical, it is an internalized ruthlessness, a political pragmatism absorbed from his healer. This subtle corruption of the ideal is the film's most sophisticated commentary. The protagonist didn't just cure a prince, she forged a co-ruler, molding him in the image of her own necessary sharpness. This mirrors the difficult transitions seen in cinematic portrayals of revolutionaries who, upon gaining power, find themselves forced to adopt the very authoritarian tactics they initially fought against, a painful mirroring of past antagonists. The protagonist's final status within the court is a fascinating paradox. She is simultaneously indispensable and deeply suspect. She holds immense informal power, the ear of the sovereign, yet she remains forever the outsider whose qualifications are based on a single, miraculously successful intervention. This precarious position necessitates constant vigilance, preventing her from ever fully relaxing into the comfort of royalty. Her emotional arc concludes not with relief, but with a weary acceptance of perpetual warfare, albeit now fought from a position of strength. The intensity of her gaze in the final moments often communicates volumes, a silent acknowledgement to Elian that the game never truly ends, and that their continued reign depends on their unwavering, shared paranoia. Furthermore, the film subtly critiques the societal impulse to romanticize sickness as a form of purity. By healing Elian, the protagonist effectively erases the court's prior, convenient narrative about his delicate, innocent nature. The restored prince is capable of political cruelty, capable of making hard choices, making him far more dangerous, and therefore, ironically, far more fit to rule in that corrupted environment. This challenges the audience's initial sympathy. Were they rooting for Elian's well-being, or for the romantic tragedy that his illness guaranteed? The protagonist's narrative arc confirms that in structures of power, pragmatic capability trumps inherent goodness every time. This mirrors the career choices of many influential screenwriters or producers who pivot from idealism to commercial realism, understanding that influence demands strategic compromise. The true triumph of the narrative lies in its refusal to provide a clean break from the past. The shadows are merely redistributed, not eradicated. The audience is left contemplating whether the protagonist's continued presence is truly for Elian's benefit, or if she remains tethered to the palace because she now recognizes that only from this apex of power can she ensure her own long-term security. Hey, sickly prince, your mind to fix concludes not with a wedding march, but with the cold, calculated clicking of political chess pieces locking into their final, terrifying positions, promising a future where competence and ambition, rather than bloodline or virtue, will dictate survival. The unspoken contract between Elian and the protagonist deepens into a shared understanding of necessary deceit, a realization that the kingdom's true illness was not Elian's physical state, but the performative morality of the nobility. Their shared knowledge becomes a psychological armor. Consider the way they communicate now. Glances across crowded halls carry the weight of strategic planning, substituting for the lengthy, clandestine meetings of the past. This evolved nonverbal lexicon is fascinating, suggesting a synchronization of thought that rivals decades of familial bonding. Elian, having shed his fragility, now mirrors the protagonist's own intense focus, his previously passive demeanor replaced by a controlled stillness that is far more intimidating than any overt display of anger. This transformation owes much to the inspiration drawn from historical accounts of sidelined heirs mentored by politically astute figures, often women operating outside the formal lines of succession, who taught them that the greatest defense is preemptive action disguised as prudence. The protagonist's inner conflict, while outwardly resolved by achieving her strategic goals, manifests subtly in her interaction with the very luxuries she has now access to. There is a lingering hesitancy, a refusal to fully inhabit the silk and jewels, indicating that she still views her position as temporary or entirely transactional. She treats the opulence not as comfort, but as costume, a necessary uniform for the role of queen or powerful consort. This undercurrent of alienation is often highlighted when she seeks out moments of her old life, perhaps revisiting the cramped workshop or hidden library that furnished her initial knowledge, only to find that those places now feel alien to the person she has become. This separation from her origins mirrors the trajectory of artists who achieve massive mainstream success, but find their early, raw inspiration difficult to recapture, leading to a more polished, yet perhaps emotionally distant, final output. Elian's new political acuity is marked by his handling of the former antagonists. Instead of outright executing the defeated courtiers, a move that would brand him a tyrant too quickly, he employs a subtler form of political neutralization, reassigning them to meaningless, distant posts, or burdening them with impossible oversight tasks. This calculated mercy, clearly suggested by the protagonist, demonstrates his understanding that eliminating enemies creates martyrs, whereas rendering them irrelevant dissolves their power base slowly and organically. This strategic patience is the mark of a truly educated ruler, a sharp departure from the impulsive reactions expected of a young prince suddenly thrust into power. He has learned that the fix involves managing perception as much as managing reality. The lingering question that the film deliberately leaves unanswered concerns the possibility of genuine, uncomplicated affection emerging from such a purely strategic genesis. Do they love each other, or do they merely require each other's competence to survive? The ambiguity is key to the film's sophisticated tone. Any overt display of romantic passion would cheapen the hard-won political victory. Instead, their moments of true closeness are often characterized by shared exhaustion after a long day of ruling, leaning on each other not for emotional comfort, but for strategic affirmation, a silent nod confirming that the compromises made were worth the security achieved. Their bond is built on competency, a shared vision of a functional, if ruthless, state, making their pairing a formidable political unit that transcends the superficialities of courtly romance, solidifying their alliance as the film's true, enduring passion. The enduring power of, "Hey, sickly prince, your mind to fix," rests on its successful transposition of the medical drama framework onto the political thriller genre, using the body as the ultimate metaphor for the state. The entire narrative arc functions as a political diagnosis, where the protagonist assumes the role of the radical diagnostician who dares to treat the systemic infection rather than just the visible symptoms. This is profoundly resonant with historical narratives where individuals possessing specialized, often marginalized knowledge, like early bacteriologists or pioneering surgeons, faced intense institutional resistance precisely because their insights threatened the established, comfortable order that benefited from the status quo. The protagonist's confidence in her unorthodox remedies is the very core of her perceived hubris by the old guard. Ilian's complete rehabilitation into a viable ruler requires him to internalize the protagonist's worldview, moving from a passive patient awaiting care to an active co-conspirator. This transition is evidenced in his growing capacity for calculated cruelty, a necessary trait for survival in the viper's nest he inherited. When he makes a decision that deliberately harms a former ally to secure a tactical advantage, the audience recognizes the shadow of the protagonist's tutelage. This is the crucial moment where the fix is complete. Elian is no longer the sickly prince needing saving, but a powerful operative capable of executing the difficult, ethically gray policies required to maintain their joint rule. The actor playing Elian, having navigated this arc, often draws critical praise for successfully bridging the gap between perceived weakness and absolute control, a feat often compared to the nuanced character reversals mastered by veteran stage actors transitioning to screen authority figures. The external world's reaction to the newly fortified court is depicted with cynical realism. Neighboring kingdoms and powerful noble houses initially view Elian's recovery with suspicion, sensing that the source of his sudden vigor is external and untrustworthy. The narrative cleverly employs diplomatic encounters where the protagonist, though often sidelined formally, dictates the subtext of every negotiation through her sheer presence and whispered counsel to Elian. She becomes the kingdom's shadow chancellor, her influence palpable even in her silence. These diplomatic scenes highlight the film's inspiration from historical contexts, where a consort or regent, despite holding no formal title, effectively steered national policy through sheer personal magnetism and intellectual superiority over the nominal ruler. Finally, the film's enduring theme is the heavy cost of true competence. The protagonist never fully achieves the comfort or social acceptance she might have desired. Her reward is the burden of shared, absolute responsibility. The quiet moments between the rulers are less about tenderness and more about reassessment, a nightly audit of threats and resources. Their shared future is not a paradise earned, but a highly fortified outpost secured through relentless effort. This deliberate avoidance of sentimental resolution confirms the film's commitment to its political thesis. In a truly broken system, salvation is synonymous with gaining the power necessary to enforce one's own vision, irrespective of popular approval or personal ease. Their bond is not love, but an unbreakable operational necessity, the foundation of a state built on shared pragmatism. The film expertly manages the audience's perception of the protagonist's moral compass by framing her unwavering dedication to Elian's recovery as a necessary evil, a path paved with good intentions that inevitably leads to morally ambiguous territory. Her initial self-justification that the kingdom cannot afford to lose Ilian, regardless of his personal character, begins to blur as she invests more of herself into his political education. There are fleeting sequences, perhaps showing her solitary moments of reflection late at night, where a flicker of doubt crosses her features. Whether the transformation of Elian has surpassed the scope of her original intent. This internal grappling elevates her from a mere political operator to a tragic figure who must sacrifice her own potential for moral simplicity in exchange for efficacy. The actress in this role often employs micro-expressions, a slight tightening around the eyes, a pause before issuing a harsh order, to convey the weight of these necessary compromises, drawing on the discipline required by performers known for playing complex historical figures whose legacies are debated precisely because their methods were so contradictory to their stated goals. Elian, now fully awakened politically, begins to demonstrate an almost intuitive understanding of deception, a skill he must practice to maintain the illusion of normalcy while rooting out hidden conspirators. His vulnerability is not gone, but rather redirected. It now manifests as an extreme, almost paranoid protectiveness over the protagonist. Any perceived slight against her by court functionaries elicits a response from him that is far more severe and nuanced than the brute force retribution of a tyrant. He understands that her removal would collapse his reign, making her safety his most vital state secret. This dynamic forces the film into subtle power, plays where Elian actively seeks out the protagonist's approval on key political moves, not because he doubts his own judgment, but because her external validation confirms the strategic soundness of his actions, creating a recursive loop of reliance that is now intellectual rather than physical. The architectural design of the court itself continues to serve as a psychological landscape reflecting their evolving power. Where once the shadows concealed Elian's sickness, now they are weaponized to conceal the couple's joint machinations. Secret passages and soundproofed annexes, previously utilized for clandestine medical treatments, become the nerve centers for statecraft. The camera work emphasizes this shift. Steady, wide shots frame the two leaders together, emphasizing their united front against the vast, intimidating backdrop of the palace, suggesting that the structure itself has been bent to their shared will. This echoes filmmaking styles that focus on political duos, where the visual composition must convey collaboration and mutual threat assessment simultaneously, drawing inspiration from cinematic explorations of Cold War power pairings where trust was the most volatile commodity. The final resolution avoids painting their governance as a utopia. Instead, it portrays a state of hyper-efficient, cold stability. The lingering sense of unease for the audience stems from the knowledge that the foundation of this stable reign is built upon a carefully managed lie. The lie that Elian's recovery was natural, and the lie that the protagonist acts purely out of dedication rather than self-preservation. Their shared silence, the culmination of their communication, is the loudest statement. They have achieved power, but at the cost of all innocence, both personal and political. Their connection remains defined by the crucible of the sickness, a permanent, shared scar that binds them in a partnership where sentiment is irrelevant, replaced entirely by the relentless, taxing work of sustained political survival. The very air within the palace seems to have adopted the protagonist's steely temperament, following the successful consolidation of power. Gone is the breathless urgency that characterized the initial healing process. In its place settles a pervasive, almost chilling calm. This atmosphere reflects the protagonist's mastery over the environment, having successfully purged the overt threats. Yet this calm is deceptive, built upon the constant, exhausting suppression of potential dissent. The film often visualizes this maintenance through scenes of paperwork, strategic correspondence, and lengthy silent cabinet meetings where the protagonist's quiet disapproval carries more weight than any minister's impassioned speech. She has mastered the art of governance through suggestion and implied consequence, a subtle dominion honed by years of operating beneath the radar. Elian, in turn, has fully embraced the role of the calculating sovereign, shedding the last vestiges of the sensitive boy who was his former self. His emotional repertoire is now deliberately narrow, focused primarily on projecting unshakable authority. When he displays moments of warmth, they are reserved exclusively for the protagonist, and even these gestures are often politically charged. A public acknowledgement of her counsel, perhaps, designed to inoculate her against further courtly attack by making her indispensable to his visible strength. This mirrors the complex personal lives of historical monarchs whose political alliances often necessitated the public elevation of non-traditional partners, using affection as a strategic shield. The actor portraying this late-stage Elian excels in portraying guardedness. Every smile is scrutinized by the audience for hidden motive, a testament to the depth of his conditioning by the protagonist. The film explores the idea that profound, sustained intimacy, when forged under extreme duress, often transcends conventional definitions of romance, settling instead into a form of operational codependency. Their bond is less about shared dreams and more about shared nightmares, the knowledge of what it took to reach this point, and the terrifying realization of how easily it could all unravel. This is communicated through rituals that are intensely private, yet utterly devoid of traditional romantic iconography. Perhaps they share a final, unsweetened glass of wine each night, not as a toast to victory, but as a quiet confirmation that they both survived another day of deception and rule. These scenes rely heavily on the cinematography to convey emotion. Long takes hold on their hands resting near each other on a map table, the tension residing not in touch, but in the proximity of absolute power. The critique against the kingdom's former reliance on the sickly prince narrative is perhaps the most poignant element. The court was obsessed with preserving an image of fragility and purity that was politically convenient for the true power brokers. By restoring Elian to robust health, a health imbued with cunning, the protagonist has forced the entire political ecosystem to adapt to a new reality where strength is valued over superficial propriety. This narrative choice serves as a powerful allegory for institutional change. Real reform rarely involves returning to a pristine past, but rather building a future based on the harsh lessons learned during periods of crisis. The film thus ends not with the promise of peace, but with the uneasy anticipation of the protagonist and Elian's next inevitable political confrontation, solidifying their legacy as pragmatic architects rather than idealized heroes. The final lingering impression left by "Hey Sickly Prince, Your Mind to Fix" is one of necessary high-stakes pragmatism triumphing over sentimental idealism. The success of their joint rule is predicated on their shared awareness that the initial fix was merely the removal of a single obstacle, the prince's debilitating weakness, and not the eradication of the environment that caused it. This perpetual state of defense necessitates a continuous, almost artistic performance of unity and strength. The protagonist, having abandoned any pretense of living a quiet life outside the court's machinations, now occupies a space of permanent, high-alert engagement. Her personal narrative has been entirely subsumed into the machinery of the state she helped rebuild. This mirrors the careers of influential advisors or strategists who become so integral to a political machine that separating themselves from it would mean instant professional and perhaps physical obsolescence. Elian's evolution into a formidable ruler is underscored by his capacity to absorb and then reinterpret the protagonist's lessons. Where she might have emphasized calculated risk, he now executes bold, almost audacious political maneuvers, demonstrating a mastery that proves he was not merely a puppet, but a highly adaptable student. This intellectual maturation is the ultimate validation of the protagonist's efforts. The relationship settles into a pattern where Elian initiates the broad strategy, and the protagonist refines the tactical execution, a seamless blend of royal authority and underground expertise. This synergy is visually represented in the film's final sequences through parallel action. Elian addressing a public assembly with unwavering conviction, while the protagonist oversees a crucial internal security detail, both actions conveying the same message of impenetrable control. The film's subtle critique of narrative expectation is perhaps its sharpest point. The audience is trained throughout historical fantasy to anticipate a romantic reward for the intense suffering endured. Hey, sickly prince denies this gratification, suggesting that true partnership forged in political fire is fundamentally different from conventional romance. Their bond is less about desire and more about perfect complementarity, a shared skill set that makes them politically unstoppable. Any potential romantic dialogue or gesture is deliberately undercut by a sudden interjection of state business or a reminder of a pending threat, ensuring that the audience never settles into complacency regarding their emotional status. In conclusion, the film operates as a dark blueprint for effective, albeit ethically compromised, leadership. The journey from sickly dependency to co-regency is a brutal commentary on the transactional nature of power. Salvation is only achieved when the saved party internalizes the savior's methods. The final, enduring image is not one of shared affection, but of two profoundly competent individuals standing guard over a kingdom they have fundamentally reshaped, bound by secrets and the shared knowledge that morality is a luxury only the powerless can afford. Their reign is secure, but their existence is one of perpetual calculated vigilance, a monument to ambition realized at the highest possible emotional cost. The inherent stability of their joint rule, once established, paradoxically introduces a new, subtle form of internal strain, the challenge of maintaining momentum after the initial crisis has passed. The adrenaline of survival fades, leaving behind the mundane yet relentless demands of governing. This period tests whether their relationship is robust enough to withstand the quiet erosion of constant administrative responsibility. For the protagonist, the transition from crisis interventionist to permanent policymaker is particularly fraught. She misses the clear, singular objective of fixing Elian. The ambiguity of day-to-day political management requires a different, more tedious form of focus. We see this in moments where she meticulously reviews tax ledgers or complex trade agreements, tasks far removed from the dramatic application of obscure remedies, yet equally crucial. Her mastery here is demonstrated not through passion, but through sheer, uncompromising rigor, a quality often celebrated in figures whose influence grew by mastering bureaucratic detail rather than battlefield heroics. Elian, now burdened by the full weight of his inherited kingdom's problems, sometimes looks back with a strange nostalgia for the simplicity of his illness. His suffering, for all its pain, provided a clear external enemy and a singular focus for the protagonist's attention. Ruling requires confronting myriad, often frustratingly complex issues where no single, elegant fix exists. In these moments of political fatigue, he might retreat into brief, guarded conversations with the protagonist, seeking not solutions, but a return to the shared, high-stakes drama of their early days. These are the most emotionally revealing scenes, not of love, but of mutual reliance on past intensity. He seeks the clarity of the crisis, while she reminds him, often wordlessly, that the crisis is ongoing, merely hidden beneath layers of statecraft. The film's visual language subtly shifts again to reflect this settled state. The harsh, revealing light of the confrontation scenes softens slightly, replaced by the warm, deep tones of a well-maintained, yet formidable seat of power. However, the protagonist is rarely placed squarely within the center of this warmth. She often occupies the periphery of official portraits, or stands near large, unadorned windows, suggesting an enduring detachment from the comforts she helped secure. This visual framing ensures the audience never fully accepts her assimilation into the aristocracy. She remains the necessary shadow cast by the prince's renewed light, a constant reminder that true power often resides just outside the official frame. Ultimately, the film suggests that the most successful political pairings are those built not on shared sentimentality, but on an unshakable respect for competence, even when that competence necessitates ruthlessness. The bond between the prince and the protagonist is a machine perfected for governance in a hostile world. They are not partners in romance, but in empire. Their legacy is secured not by public adoration, but by the kingdom's silent, enduring functionality. The final emotional note is one of grim satisfaction. They succeeded in their task, they command their realm, but the innocence required to enjoy it was sacrificed long ago on the altar of necessity. Their union is the ultimate expression of pragmatic ambition realized. The profound exhaustion that settles over the protagonist and Elian is not just the weariness of labor, but the spiritual fatigue born of constant moral calculus. They have achieved dominance, yet the throne feels less like a seat of honor and more like a highly polished, perpetually armed cage. This exhaustion manifests in small, telling habits. Elian now habitually fiddles with a signet ring he never used before, a nervous tic developed from endlessly signing warrants, while the protagonist has developed a near-invisible tremor in her left hand, a souvenir from the years spent balancing poison threats and strategic alliances. These physical manifestations serve as a silent, shared acknowledgement that the price of their functional utopia was their individual peace. The protagonist finds that the greatest threat now comes not from external enemies, but from the very nature of prolonged influence. Having spent so long in the aggressive posture required to educate Elian, she struggles to modulate her intensity. In advisory sessions concerning matters of mere infrastructure or localized disputes, her impatience flares, manifesting as a sharp, cutting tone that can intimidate even loyal subordinates. Elian must now occasionally step in to mediate her interactions with the court, a subtle but profound reversal of roles where he acts as her diplomatic buffer, tempering her raw efficacy with the necessary veneer of royal magnanimity. This forces the protagonist to confront the irony. She must rely on Elian's acquired charm to smooth over the rough edges of the strength she instilled in him. Elian's mastery over the court is chillingly complete, because he anticipates threats before they fully form, often using the protagonist's own past methodologies against lesser foes. He institutes mandatory, randomized inspections of royal provisioning and personnel rosters, measures clearly inspired by the protagonist's paranoia during his illness, which keeps everyone off balance and loyal through fear of the unknown. Yet when he uses these tactics against someone who genuinely pose no threat, purely to maintain the illusion of external danger, a shadow of profound sadness crosses his face. He recognizes that he is preserving the state by replicating the very atmosphere of suspicion that once nearly destroyed him. This momentary flicker of authentic self-loathing is the closest the film gets to outright tragedy in their reign. Their shared moments of respite are increasingly devoid of human warmth, resembling instead the calibration of advanced machinery. They might review intelligence reports together in absolute silence, communicating complex instructions through the placement of their hands on the parchment, a pointed finger indicating urgency, a slight overlap of hands signaling shared endorsement. This is the apex of their operational intimacy, a perfect, wordless understanding of the state's equilibrium. The film suggests that this is the only form of connection capable of surviving the corrosive pressures of absolute power. They are not two people who fell in love. They are two essential components of a single, brutally efficient political engine, forever locked in a symbiotic relationship